Hey guys, this is going to be quick sketching Sargent heads. I'm just going to be doing a few showing my process, some of the things that Sargent used to get a likeness, some other things like Reilly rhythms and other things that, other people talk about. It's going to be fun. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get right into it. So I already did a few warm-up sketches. They're a bit off screen because it's a very large pad of paper, but just generally trying to get my hand a little warmed up, just a few. We're going to get right into this. Without further ado, when you're first drawing the head, it's useful to draw a circle, and I'm sure everybody's heard of this. You just draw a very basic shape of the circle because from a frontal view, the cranium has a very circular kind of shape to it from the front. From the side, it's more of an oval or a bowl shape. But anyway, so you want to do that circle, and then you split the circle in half, generally speaking, and this is more of the Loomis / Reilly method because I'm going to be introducing some rhythm lines as well. But you split the line in half, and this is going to be essentially the brown line. So we take that brown line, and then you go 1, 2, and then you add a third on. And this is what Loomis did. And then once you have these three different parts, you have the nose line, the brow line, the forehead line, and the chin line. And this isn't going to be true for every single portrait that you do because it's going to vary depending on what likeness you're getting. But for this guy, we're going to see if that holds true. So the bottom of his chin, I'm going to measure right here to his nose. That's 1. So we can see that that's off 2 and 3, way off. So this guy's a very interesting head. So right from the start, we're going to get those measurements correct. And that's going to help us a lot in the future stages. So let's see. We can keep this measurement, right, because we know that's a third. And we know that the nose and the forehead are actually an even measurement as well. So it looks like even more go like that, something like that. Let's see. And then we're going to get in the general shape of the head. And we know that, let's see here, the nose is going to line up right around there. We're going to try to be a little generally loose on this as well. So the eyebrows, this guy's really interesting eyebrows, but for the Reilly rhythm, the eyebrows, it's more just a little U, sort of like that. But for this guy, it's a little bit different, so we're going to see. It's kind of like that almost. Sees this very interesting expression. And then that comes down to the nose. And a lot of the time when you're seeing artists do the Reilly rhythm, or the Reilly method rather, they'll draw in a proxy for the nose here. So just kind of a placeholder. What they'll do is that they'll grab an oval or a circle depending on the sitter here, and then they grab that shape, and then they'll put in the little nose brow shape, which is usually like a Starbucks cup almost, or just a coffee cup. So we have that as a placeholder now. It's going to help us kind of flesh out the actual shape of the nose. And then also with the mouth, the shape of the mouth is very muzzle-like. So you can see that this is also a rhythm line. If you look up the Reilly head rhythm lines, you'll see the rhythm of the face goes around the muzzle right here. So you'll see that generally speaking a lot of the time. Looks like everything's relatively correct. So we're just gonna put in that mustache. I really like mustaches because they help give you a solid shape around a lot of larger shapes that otherwise be not disconnected. So when you have really large shapes, especially in the head, it's kind of hard to do the shape method that Sargent would usually employ, where you're just checking shapes, you're not using as many measurements or constructive anatomy, like sort of what I'm doing here. And the problem with that is that it's really easy to mess up really large shapes if you don't have an intuitive understanding of how to draw. So it's a lot easier. In this case, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use the mustache, and that's going to help me actually grab out where a shape's correct and where it's incorrect, because the smaller the shape is, usually the easier it is to tell if your version of it is accurate or not. So it comes around here. Boom. And then I'm going to check the distance from the eyebrow to the hairline right there. It's about that tall. And it doesn't really have to be perfect. Just generally correct. And another thing that you're going to see in a lot of Reilly drawings is that there's these lines from the forehead that connect right around the edge of the eyebrow where it turns over. And that creates this sort of square shape a lot of the time. And for some people, it's more of a circle shape, but it goes through the eyelids, and you get this like really large circle basically. And it helps you place where the head is actually turning over. So that's interesting as well. So you can usually put that, and that'll help you actually place the shapes on the head. So in this case, kind of goes over here. And we're going to check that. Something like that. And then we can just really easily block in some of that shadow side. And not getting too bogged down into the details is going to help us loosen up, because this isn't supposed to be a perfect master copy. It's supposed to be just a study, right? And Sargent, of course, was known for working quick, relatively speaking. He would spend weeks on oil painting sometimes, but his work always shows a lot of bravado and speed, because when he actually put brush to canvas, he certainly was not working slow. It was mostly the time that he spent painting where the spaces in between him putting his brush on the canvas and him stepping back, because he would spend a lot of time determining on what to do next. And he'd do a lot of memory drawing, which is one of the things one of my subscribers actually told me about in my other Sargent video. So now I'm just seeing where this ear is going to line up, and it looks like it's lining up right around there. And this is called the envelope method that I just did with the ear. And what it's doing is that if you have a very organic shape, that for example, and I'm trying to draw this shape on my reference, then what you can do is that you can just use your angles and you can kind of box in the general shape. So you make the more organic shape more angular, and then it can help you bring in the more subtle curves. So you can see that that's sort of a subtle curve, and then this comes off of the eye line. So we know that that's kind of like that. And Sargent always used really sharp lines in his nostrils, and you can see that once we go into some other people in this book. You're going to see that pretty definitely. And I'm convinced that Sargent knew his nose anatomy, just because always his noses looked so cool, especially in his charcoal portraits. And he really had a lot of fun designing them, I think at least. So he was sort of, he said that he always painted what he saw, but I always assumed that he was a bit of a caricaturist. So if you could take caricature to a very minimal extent and just apply it to your drawings in a very realistic drawing, that's sort of what he was doing. So, consciously or unconsciously. But that's why his nose has always looked bigger than life. Because, I mean, nobody really has that interesting of a nose, at least from what I've seen. Maybe people back then just had more interesting features, I don't know. So anyway, so when you're drawing beards and really clumps of hair, you're not drawing the individual hairs. You can suggest them like Sargent did here, but what's really important for the subconscious, what's going to tip people off, say that looks wrong or whatever, the big value shapes. So we're just going to get that big value shape in there. So let's see. And whenever you're drawing, it's good to follow through different parts of the drawing. So if I see this shape right here and I'm trying to copy this line down correctly, I'm going to follow through the tip of the nose that I know is right here, and then I'm going to go down. And you can lift your pencil up, and it's called like ghosting in, where you're following the curve, and then you go down and actually strike on the paper, but you're not actually putting your paper down there. And that helps you make sure that you're lining up your things correctly, because I could say, okay, I'm going to line it up with this nose, but if I put it right here, I might misplace it. It's a lot easier to actually carry in the line. So we're going to go in here, and then I noticed this sort of rhythm right here, that interesting shape, and we're going to cut it off. Cut it off a little higher, like that. This guy's a very interesting nose. So, like that. So I brought those in. And when I'm placing eyes, it's a lot of checking the negative shapes around the eyelid. So So that's why it's important to put the eyes in last, which is what Sargent would frequently do. So you can look up unfinished Sargent drawings. He'd always put the eyes in last, or paintings even. And that was because he saw the eyes as a little spot on the apple where you need to place them correctly into the socket, or else you're not going to get the likeness correct. So he'd build up the rest of the skull around, and then he'd place in the eyes finally, which is the opposite of what you intuitively want to do. But as with a lot of things in art, your intuition is almost always wrong, at least with being precise in your drawing, your values and all that. People find that out pretty relatively quickly, though. When they try to draw something, it doesn't really look like what they want to draw. So with the eyes, you always want them to line up. So right now, this guy's interesting. He has an angle right here. So kind of just ghost in a bit of an eye there. Bam. And you can see that right there. Since he was working from life, of course, he saw those deeper core shadows. So he kind of thicken up the shadow on the edge. So you can see that this side of the face kind of curves in, almost like that. And then this is a lighter value. And this beard has a very interesting flow to it, which he'd suggest. It's just a bit smaller. And as with a lot of things in art, if you do it one time, it always looks way better than just erasing it, putting it back, using several lines to say the same thing. So that's why a lot of the time, the paintings you do the quickest always look the best, because it has a certain amount of freshness to the line work, because it doesn't look as hardened, And Sargent was so good at that. It looked like every single brush stroke was intentional, and it was masterful when he did it one time and it was done. He'd never go back and try to rework it. And that's an interesting kind of dichotomy that you see between abstraction and realism. And when you're trying to represent something realistically, a lot of the time there's difficult problems like finding the right value, because values are very relative. It's easy to make the wrong relative value in painting. So what happens is that you put something in, it looks very good abstractly because it looks fresh and all this other stuff. But what happens is that it's actually the wrong value, for example. So it looks good abstractly, but it's poor representationally. So you rework it and rework it, and you put it more and more in brush strokes. And eventually what happens is that it looks representationally correct, but it looks abstractly dead to the eye. And Sargent was just not a pawn to that sort of human restriction, because what he would do is that he had this amazing ability to just make something look abstractly brilliant and then also representationally correct, and it looked almost accidental. That's how skilled of a draftsman and a painter he was. Just wicked stuff, impossible stuff. Nobody could really do it at the level of him. Because even now, there's a lot of loose painters, but just, Sargent when you see one, All right, so decently happy with that. I'm not going to work it too much because this isn't supposed to be a copy again, like I was saying. But yeah, maybe just suggest. A little bit of a bow tie there, or regular tie, or whatever he has on. Put that on. Boom. Alright, so this guy might be a little bit more difficult because it looks like Sargent rendered out a lot more. And when he would keep things simple, it'd be a lot easier to actually correctly copy down. Because what would happen is that he would simplify to such an extent that you would only have to copy a few shapes correctly. But when he would take the extra mile, render it out a little bit more like his paintings, then be a bit more difficult to just take it to the level of finish that he had. But a lot of the time, people get caught in the trap of making things too rendered out, and they lose a lot of the vitality that they originally had, like I was talking about earlier. All right, so I'm gonna just put in the nose shape, like the Starbucks cup that we talked about earlier, and then there's usually this little bump, kind of on the nose. I know the nose finishes right here, so there's a little nose circle. And then, let's see there. So it looks like the eyebrow line goes kind of like that. And let's see. Face goes in a bit. Goes in and then. That's where the eyes are. So we're going to place the little eye shape like that. And he has really long eyelids compared to his eyebrows. Jeez. Maybe he had his eyebrow up or something when Sargent was drawing this. I always wondered how people would hold poses that long. For Sargent especially, because he would redo a lot of his stuff. He just, if it wasn't working, he'd just throw it out and restart. And honestly, that's probably the way to go. It just makes your paintings look a lot better. But Sargent was, people think that he did everything first try, and that's certainly not true, because he was human after all. So it looks more like the mustache goes in right here, kind of twirls out, and then you have the cheek rounding like that, and you have kind of this guy's a very interesting face, a lot of fat pads. We have this little hairdo here, that. And then we can see that the hairline goes up like that. And what's funny is whenever I'm copying poses or portraits from these books, I always end up going site size, even when I don't use the original measurements like I did in this one for height and width. It's kind of a funny thing. You just naturally want to do it site size. So yeah, if you're working from life and you're doing a portrait painting or drawing or whatever, highly suggest working site size. Just makes everything easier. And it's not really, I'd consider cheating, if there is such a thing, as something that a tool that you wouldn't readily have available to you in a lot of situations. And site size certainly isn't one of them. Even when you're working from reference on your phone or something, you can back up and hold it up to the point where it's site size. So site size definitely isn't cheating or anything. I think that'd be ridiculous to say. So this guy has a very curvy face. Looks like it goes in a little bit further than originally depicted. And then something like that. And it looks also like, see, this starts there. It's an interesting shape. I'm just going to simplify that here. And looks like just basically all this is in darkness, so just give that a wash of tone. And it's good to always erase the lines that you want to fix. Otherwise, it's going to become distracting and confusing too. Because if you forget what was correct, then how do you know which line is? And it also just looks ugly visually, because complexity is ugly, generally speaking, unnecessary complexity. Okay, so the mouth ends right about there. I was always amazed by caricature artists, especially the speed that they would do things. It just blows me away, and it's almost like I'm speaking outside of my bounds of understanding here because I'm not a caricature artist. But it would seem to me that they would do things so loosely but so accurately, And I wonder if it'd be easier in some sense to get away with wrong proportions in caricature as long as you're exaggerating the individual parts of somebody. But again, I don't really know. I'd have to actually go into character and learn it. See, as you can see, I was talking about earlier with the sharp nose. Did that a lot. I always thought it looked really good, but that was signature Sargent stuff. Let's make sure that measurement is correct. And it is. So we're going to go in here. God, this guy's eye. I don't know who's hiring Sargent. I guess a lot of wealthy people look like this. Is like the archetype of the Monopoly Man, right here. Okay, so it looks like it goes in a little bit more than this. Something like that. Looks like it's hard to tell what is hair and what isn't hair. But of course, when it's in the shadow, nobody really cares. We need to bring this out a little bit more. And let's see. Got a little color there. Man, this guy's a ridiculous face. This is crazy. It's very unique. It's interesting that Sargent would throw out some of his canvases. Sometimes when he was getting the likeness right, he'd scream demons, apparently, according to one account, and he'd just throw it out and it wasn't working out. Which is actually, it makes a lot of sense, because even with portraiture, likeness is so difficult that even if you're as skilled as Sargent, one of the most famous, if not the famous, portrait artists in all of history, it's so difficult that sometimes it even comes down to a little bit of luck to get it correct. So he had to just keep cashing in until he actually got a canvas that worked for him, right? And he also liked that fresh approach, of course, like we talked about. And it really is true. It looks so much better. And that's part of what the Impressionists taught the art world. It's that freshness. There's a certain vitality and interest in it that you don't really see in really rendered drawings, art paintings. And then if you take it a bit too far, though, you can start losing the viewer, because anything in excess in nature art especially, it just doesn't really look as good. So if it's too abstract, and especially modern abstraction nowadays, where people really don't know what they're doing abstractly because they never went to representation art school, so they don't know what abstraction even is. No, a lot of the time it doesn't really read as beautifully as some other work. Representation or even abstract. But if you do go into abstraction, then I tip my hat off to you if you're interested in that. But you should understand how to paint representation because it helps you understand where abstract compositions work and fail. you know, because you can change any representational artwork into an abstract painting. You just have to simplify the details enough. And if you can get something that works representationally, it's working abstractly, at least if composition is, right? But you remove the representational elements and it loses a bit of its own character. So it's an interesting balance, but a lot of the time, learning composition, learning art in general is just a matter of being a detective in a weird way. You know, just trying out things that didn't work, try out others, you know, and maybe you'll stumble onto something new. And the artists that do that, those are the ones that go down in history. You know, and the whole freshness thing is really interesting because even other artists besides Sargent, famous artist Abbott Thayer, for example, he said that he wouldn't work on a painting for more than 3 days or else he'd ruin it. And honestly, if you've painted for a while, you can understand that sentiment. Especially if you videotape yourself painting, it's really interesting because you can see where things go south. Because eventually, I mean, if you work on a painting too much, especially a painting, sometimes drawings though too, any form of art really, but painting especially. So what happens is that you work it, you rework it, and eventually it just falls apart. Like you make it worse. You make all the values incorrect. Drawings paint talked about this. You just ruin it. And it's interesting because you don't even notice what you're doing, but everything that you do to a drawing or a painting is noticeable at some level. And you compound that over the course of hours and days of just ruining it. You know, no wonder it's gonna ruin it. You know, so Abbott Thayer was an interesting guy. Same with what's his name? The guy who made Nighthawks. He had really interesting quotes. I suggest you look up some of those. He said, if I could write it down or something, then I'd have no reason to paint. And it's an interesting proposition. Because it gets to what art is, and it's unconscious communication. You know, it's emotional communication. And you can't say in words what you can say in paint. It's really interesting. But it's something that goes beyond culture or anything else. It's a ubiquitous language that all human beings can understand. Because you can look at a work, I'm American, right? And I can look at a work of Japanese art and I can appreciate it. And I can be moved by it. You know? And that's something, right? That's something beyond language or culture. That's what makes art just so fascinating to me. Now, Sargent did this all the time in charcoal as well. He would have these like tiny white spots, and his highlights would always be really interesting. So I love those. You can see, for example, on camera here, that one right there, and then let's see where else. Like they're just all over the place. And I wondered how he'd get that because charcoal a lot of times sticks to the paper so much, so it's really difficult to keep that, right? Because if you cover up, you make a mistake or whatever, then it's just gone forever. But he did a really good job at making those clean shapes and then also just, making them bright white. Anyway, you guys, so this video is getting pretty long, so thanks for coming around, watching it. Leave me some comments about some future videos that you'd like to see, if you like this kind of content, what other content you like on my channel. I appreciate that. I hope you guys have a great day. I hope your art improves and go make something beautiful.